Stop scrolling, because nobody saw this coming. Aliyah Boston just dropped a new interview, and in a matter of minutes, the basketball world was flipped upside down. What started as a calm conversation turned into an absolute bombshell, as Boston directly responded to the ongoing controversy, and in the process, completely shut down Sheryl Swoopes while fiercely defending Caitlin Clark. This wasn't shade. This wasn't subtle. This was a statement. With composure, confidence, and zero hesitation, Aliyah Boston said what many players have been thinking, but were too careful to say out loud. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't attack personally. She did something far more powerful. She spoke facts. And those facts hit hard. As clips from the interview spread across social media, reactions exploded. Fans were stunned. Analysts paused. Comment sections turned into battlegrounds. Because Aliyah Boston didn't just defend Caitlin Clark. She dismantled the narrative surrounding her. She addressed the criticism. She called out the double standards. And without naming names directly, she made it painfully clear who she was responding to. Everyone knew exactly who the message was for. Suddenly, the conversation shifted. The focus wasn't on Caitlin Clark anymore. It was on why she ever needed defending in the first place. And Aliyah Boston stood firmly on one side of history. This moment wasn't loud, it was lethal. Because when a respected voice like Aliyah Boston speaks with clarity and conviction, the impact is undeniable. No dramatics, no exaggeration, just truth, delivered clean and unshakable. And now the question isn't whether this interview went too far. The real question is, did Aliyah Boston just end the debate for good? Eyes fire. When Aliyah Boston sat down for her latest interview, no one expected fireworks. There was no dramatic teaser, no viral countdown, no warning that what she was about to say would ignite one of the biggest conversations in women's basketball this year. But sometimes, the most explosive moments don't come from yelling. They come from calm truth. And that's exactly what happened. What began as a routine discussion about the season, team chemistry, and the state of the game took a sharp turn when the topic of Caitlin Clark came up. The room didn't tense up, but the energy changed. Because everyone knew what was hanging in the air. The criticism, the controversy, the constant commentary surrounding Caitlin Clark's name. Aliyah Boston didn't rush her answer. She didn't dodge it either. She paused. And then she spoke with a level of clarity that immediately stopped the conversation in its tracks. What followed wasn't an emotional rant. It wasn't a viral soundbite manufactured for clicks. It was something far more dangerous to the existing narrative. It was measured honesty. Aliyah Boston began by addressing the reality of the situation. That Caitlin Clark has been placed under a microscope unlike almost any other player in recent memory. Every move analyzed. Every mistake amplified. Every success questioned. And according to Boston, that scrutiny hasn't always been fair. Without naming names at first, she spoke about how certain voices in basketball media have framed Caitlin Clark's success in ways that feel dismissive, selective, and inconsistent. She pointed out how praise often comes with a qualifier, and how criticism seems to come quicker than understanding. That's when fans watching realized something important. Aliyah Boston wasn't just talking generally. She was responding. As the interview continued, her message became sharper. Not aggressive, but precise. She explained how narratives can shape public perception, and how repeated commentary can quietly turn respect into resentment. Then came the line that sent social media into chaos. Boston made it clear that Caitlin Clark's impact on the game is undeniable, and that trying to minimize it does a disservice not just to one player, but to women's basketball as a whole. That's when the dots connected. Because for weeks, fans had been debating comments made by Sheryl Swoopes, comments that questioned aspects of Caitlin Clark's hype, impact, and coverage. Those remarks sparked endless arguments online, dividing fans and igniting a larger conversation about respect, legacy, and evolution in the game. Aliyah Boston didn't repeat those comments. She didn't need to. Her response was stronger without direct quotes. She emphasized that the game has room for growth, new stars, and new styles, and that honoring the past shouldn't mean attacking the present. She spoke about how generational change is inevitable, and how resistance to that change often comes disguised as critique. That hit hard, because coming from Aliyah Boston, a player respected across the league for her professionalism, intelligence, and leadership, those words carried weight. This wasn't a fan defending her favorite player. This was a peer, a competitor, a champion, and that's why the reaction was immediate. Within hours, clips of the interview were everywhere. Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Reddit. The captions were blunt. Aliyah Boston cooked. She said what needed to be said. This was aimed directly at Swoopes. The debate reignited, but this time the tone was different. Because Aliyah Boston didn't escalate the drama. She reframed it. She talked about respect, not just for Caitlin Clark, but for what she represents. A new wave of players bringing unprecedented attention, audiences, and opportunities to the sport. According to Boston, tearing that down helps no one. She explained that criticism is part of the game, but so is fairness. And when criticism starts feeling personal or selective, it stops being productive. That distinction mattered. And it landed. Fans who had been on the fence suddenly picked sides. Neutral observers acknowledged that Boston's perspective felt grounded. Even people who didn't fully agree with her tone admitted one thing. She didn't lie. What made this moment even more powerful was how calm she remained throughout the interview. No raised voice. No sarcasm. No attempts to embarrass anyone. Just facts delivered with confidence. That calmness made the message louder. Because when someone that composed speaks that directly, it signals conviction. It tells the audience this isn't about clout. It's about principle. And the principle was clear. Caitlin Clark deserves respect, not disclaimers. Aliyah Boston also addressed the bigger picture. She spoke about how women's basketball is finally experiencing a surge of attention, and how internal division only slows that momentum. She stressed that there's space for legends and newcomers to coexist, without tearing each other down. That statement felt like both a defense and a challenge. A defense of Caitlin Clark. A challenge to the culture around commentary. And for many fans, it felt overdue. By the end of the interview, Aliyah Boston hadn't just defended Caitlin Clark. She had reset the conversation. The narrative shifted from, is Caitlin Clark overrated? To, why are we questioning growth at all? And that shift mattered, because it exposed something deeper than a single disagreement. It revealed a tension between eras. Between how the game was and where it's going. Aliyah Boston chose a side. Not loudly, not recklessly, but firmly. And once she did, there was no pretending this was just another interview. This was a line drawn. Coming up next, we'll break down why Aliyah Boston's words hit so hard, how they directly challenged Sheryl Swoopes' earlier remarks, and why this moment may have permanently changed the tone of the Caitlin Clark debate. Because this wasn't just a response. It was a turning point. Fire eyes. By the time Aliyah Boston's interview finished circulating online, it was clear this wasn't just another clip going viral. It was a direct disruption. Because what made Boston's comments so powerful wasn't just what she said. It was who she said it as, and when she chose to speak. Aliyah Boston isn't a commentator on the outside looking in. She's not a fan. She's not chasing clicks. She's a current player, a respected leader, and someone whose voice carries credibility across generations of women's basketball. That's why her words landed like a warning shot. For weeks leading up to this interview, the conversation around Caitlin Clark had grown louder and more divisive. Sheryl Swoopes' public comments questioning the hype, framing the coverage as excessive, and implying imbalance had already sparked backlash. Some fans agreed. Others felt those remarks crossed a line. But until Aliyah Boston spoke, the debate lived mostly online. Boston dragged it into reality. She didn't repeat Swoopes' words, but she dismantled the logic behind them. She challenged the idea that celebrating Caitlin Clark somehow erases past greatness. She rejected the notion that spotlighting one player damages the game. And that rejection was surgical. Boston made it clear that growth in women's basketball doesn't come from protecting legacy. It comes from expanding opportunity. And trying to dim a rising star doesn't preserve history. It limits the future. That statement alone reframed the entire argument. Because suddenly, the debate wasn't about Caitlin Clark being overhyped. It was about why some voices felt threatened by attention shifting. That's when the tone changed. Fans began revisiting Sheryl Swoopes' earlier comments with a new lens. Not anger, but scrutiny. They asked whether criticism was rooted in analysis or discomfort with change. Aliyah Boston never accused anyone directly. She didn't have to. Her message exposed the contradiction on its own. She pointed out that women's basketball has spent decades fighting for visibility. And now that visibility has finally arrived, it's being questioned internally. According to Boston, that makes no sense. And that's where the interview crossed from opinion into confrontation. Because when a respected current player says that public criticism from legends can stall momentum, it forces accountability. Not just from Swoopes, but from media culture as a whole. Boston's calm delivery made the confrontation unavoidable. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't appear defensive. She spoke like someone who had already made peace with her position. That confidence rattled people. Social media reacted instantly. Supporters of Caitlin Clark praised Boston for standing on business. Neutral fans admitted the points were hard to argue. Even critics of Clark were forced to acknowledge that Boston's argument wasn't emotional. It was logical. And logic is hard to shout down. This moment also highlighted something rarely discussed openly: the tension between honoring legends and embracing evolution. Aliyah Boston tackled that tension head-on. She made it clear that respecting the past doesn't require policing the present. That legends don't lose value because new stars gain attention. And that the game doesn't shrink when someone shines, it grows. Those words felt aimed. Because Sheryl Swoopes represents an era that fought to be seen. Caitlin Clark represents an era that is finally being watched. Aliyah Boston stood in the middle and chose the future. That choice resonated deeply with younger players and fans. Many saw Boston's comments as a protective move, not just for Caitlin Clark, but for the direction of women's basketball itself. Because if players don't defend growth, who will? The interview also exposed how media framing influences public opinion. Boston subtly criticized how selective narratives can fuel unnecessary division. She emphasized that disagreement is healthy, but repeated dismissal becomes damaging. That distinction mattered. It turned the spotlight away from Caitlin Clark's performance and onto how commentary shapes perception. And once that spotlight moved, it didn't go back. This is why many fans described the interview as ending the debate. Not because everyone suddenly agreed, but because the argument lost its foundation. Aliyah Boston didn't argue stats. She didn't argue popularity. She argued fairness. And fairness is difficult to counter without revealing bias. By the end of the interview, the power dynamic had shifted. Sheryl Swoopes' comments were no longer the final word. They became part of a larger conversation, one that included player voices, peer perspective, and present-day reality. And that inclusion changed everything. This wasn't about disrespecting a legend. It was about setting boundaries. Boston made it clear that criticism should uplift the game, not fracture it. That accountability goes both ways. And that public platforms carry responsibility. Those statements landed differently coming from someone actively shaping the league. And that's why this moment mattered so much. It marked a turning point where players stopped letting narratives be defined about them and started defining them themselves. Aliyah Boston didn't just defend Caitlin Clark. She defended progress. And once that line was drawn, the conversation could never return to where it started. Coming up next, we'll examine the fallout, how fans, media figures, and even former players responded after this interview, and why Aliyah Boston's stance may permanently change how criticism is handled in women's basketball. Because this wasn't just a response. It was a reset. Fire eyes. After Aliyah Boston's interview went viral, the conversation didn't slow down. It split open. What had once been a debate confined to social media threads and selective commentary became a full-scale reckoning about voice, power, and responsibility in women's basketball. Because once a current star spoke with that level of clarity, there was no going back. The fallout was immediate. Fans didn't just react, they reevaluated. Old clips resurfaced. Past quotes were re-examined. Context mattered more than ever. And for the first time, the narrative wasn't being driven solely by media figures or legacy voices. It was being driven by players. That shift alone was historic. Aliyah Boston's comments gave permission to others, not necessarily to attack, but to speak honestly. Players began echoing similar sentiments in subtle ways. Some liked posts. Others shared clips. A few hinted at agreement without adding fuel. But the message was clear: Boston wasn't alone. And that realization changed everything. Because once players collectively signal that a line has been crossed, the industry has to listen. Media conversations became more careful. Pundits adjusted tone. Language softened. Not because anyone was silenced, but because accountability had entered the room. Sheryl Swoopes, whether directly responding or not, now found her comments framed differently. Not erased, not dismissed, but challenged. And that challenge came from a place of credibility that couldn't be ignored. Aliyah Boston didn't represent fandom. She represented the locker room. That distinction mattered. The debate also evolved beyond Caitlin Clark herself. What started as a defense of one player expanded into a broader discussion about how women's basketball talks about success. Who gets celebrated? Who gets questioned? And why? Fans began asking harder questions. Why does popularity invite skepticism instead of pride? Why is growth treated like imbalance? Why does visibility suddenly become a problem once it arrives? Aliyah Boston didn't ask those questions directly, but her interview made them unavoidable. And that's where the legacy of this moment truly begins. Because this wasn't about winning an argument. It was about resetting the culture. For years, women's basketball has fought external battles for airtime, respect, resources. Internal unity was always seen as a strength. But unity doesn't mean silence. And Aliyah Boston proved that respectful confrontation can strengthen the game instead of weakening it. She modeled a new standard, one where players speak up without tearing down, where criticism is allowed, but context is required, where progress isn't treated like a threat. That standard will outlive this moment. Young players watching this unfold are learning something crucial. Their voices matter now, not later. They don't have to wait until retirement to shape the narrative around their sport. That's powerful. And it's exactly why this interview will be remembered long after the headlines fade. Caitlin Clark, interestingly, didn't need to say a word. Aliyah Boston said enough. That silence from Clark, paired with Boston's defense, created a balance that fans respected. It showed maturity. It showed trust. And it reinforced the idea that this wasn't about drama. It was about principle. The media landscape adjusted quickly. Segments that once framed Caitlin Clark with qualifiers shifted toward acknowledgement. Praise became less conditional. Conversations became more nuanced. Not perfect, but improved. And that improvement traces back to one interview. Aliyah Boston didn't change women's basketball overnight. But she accelerated something that was already building. A movement toward fairness, clarity, and forward-thinking dialogue. This moment also redefined what leadership looks like. Leadership isn't always loud. It isn't always positional. And it isn't always comfortable. Sometimes leadership is choosing to speak when silence would be easier. Aliyah Boston chose to speak. And in doing so, she reminded everyone that growth doesn't happen by protecting comfort. It happens by challenging it. Years from now, when people look back at this era of women's basketball, they won't just remember record-breaking performances or viral highlights. They'll remember moments like this, when players took control of the narrative and demanded better. Not just for themselves, but for the game. Caitlin Clark will continue to shine. Legends like Sheryl Swoopes will always be part of the foundation. And voices like Aliyah Boston will shape the bridge between them. That bridge is where the future lives. This wasn't a feud. It was a course correction. And once a course is corrected, the destination changes. Women's basketball is moving forward, louder, bigger, and more visible than ever before. And moments like this ensure that when it grows with intention. Aliyah Boston didn't destroy anyone. She did something far more impactful. She drew a boundary, and the entire basketball world felt it. Fire eyes. If you're still here, then you already know. This wasn't just another basketball story. This was a line drawn. Aliyah Boston didn't raise her voice. She didn't call names. But what she said shook the conversation in a way no tweet ever could. And now, women's basketball is standing at a crossroads. The question is simple. What kind of coverage do we support? If you believe players deserve fair respect, smash the like button. If you're tired of selective narratives and double standards, subscribe right now. And if Aliyah Boston's words changed how you see this debate, drop a comment and say it with your chest. Because silence is a choice. This channel exists to call out moments that matter. Not for drama, but for truth. And trust me, this story isn't over. The reactions are still coming. The ripple effects are still unfolding. More voices will speak up. More narratives will be challenged. And more moments like this will define the future of the game. Turn on notifications so you don't miss what happens next. Share this video with someone who cares about women's basketball and understands why this moment was bigger than one interview. Because when fans stand behind honesty, the culture shifts. And today, the shift started here.